Welcome to In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay, where we get candid about what it takes to negotiate effectively. You'll learn from the challenges and successes of entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. We help you change the nature of your negotiations and get more from every deal you do.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of In the Ven Zone, where we help you, the small and mid-sized business, level up your negotiation, helping you to ask for more of what you want and providing you the tools and techniques to negotiate for it. And we do that by bringing you amazing guests. And today is no exception to that rule. Today, I have with me Ron Fortin, and he's amazing. And it's interesting because one of the things I love about having met Ron is one of my daughters, Lyra, introduced me to Ron and told me that I had to talk to him and get him on the show. And she was right, because we had our first call a couple of weeks ago and it was amazing. Ron is the founder and CEO of Homeschool Spanish Academy, where they work with learners ages 5 through adulthood, get Spanish fluency by connecting them to certified native Spanish speaking teachers online via Google Meets in small group, paired, or individual learning environments. They work with almost 200 teachers in Guatemala. They teach about 8,000 classes a week to students in over 50 countries around the world. Ron comes from a telecommunications consulting background. What she started doing after he graduated from Trinity University in San Antonio. And prior to that, he was in the U.S. Marine Corps. Thank you so much for serving, and thank you very much for being here. I'm always excited about my guests and loved our conversation a couple of weeks ago, and super excited about where we're going to take this discussion. Welcome, Ron. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be on your show, Christine. Thank you for having me.
So the first question I always like to ask people is, tell us, I kind of read a little bit of your bio, but fill in the blanks. How did you come to this journey? How did you come to start a Spanish academy in Guatemala, of all places?
Yeah, good question. So in my bio, I mentioned that I was in consulting, and while I was in consulting, they had this really interesting perk where you could, I was a traveling consultant. And so you could travel anywhere over the weekend. And then, just as long as you were back by Monday, you were fine. So I took a couple of days, and I had a friend who was already down in Guatemala. And basically he invited me down. I got to spend it, hang out with him. He was kind of giving me the tour of the place. And during this tour, he was like, I'm leaving in a couple of months, or towards the end of the year or something like that. My contract's ending, but I think you would be the perfect replacement for me, basically is what he said. And so I didn't say no, and I didn't say yes. And then I went back to San Antonio and, back to my consulting life. And then through a huge set of events, I basically just realized, like, wow, there's got to be more to life than just what I'm currently doing. In the consulting world, you tend to get burned out just in general. And with all the traveling, and you're everywhere, but you're nowhere. And so I wanted a little bit more. And I thought, man, I think I had the realization at that point that I needed to be within 2 to 3 degrees of separation to the end user. So I knew whatever I was going to get into, whatever I was going to get into, I would have some end user interaction or be close to it. And so before going down, I didn't actually know any Spanish. And my friend, his name's Brandon, he said, "Hey, Ron, you should probably learn Spanish before you go down." And I go, "Okay, great. How do I do that?" And he said, "Well, you could fly down for a couple of weeks. They have these great immersion schools down there. That's what Antigua is known for. And then you can fly back, hang out with your family for Christmas, and then fly down in January when your job starts." I was like, no, that's way too much money. That's a lot of time off, a lot of risk. You don't know what's going to happen." And he was like, "Well, an alternative to that is, have you ever heard of this program called Skype?" Now, keep in mind, this was 2009 or around October, November, that time frame. And so Skype was just starting to hit its popularity stride. And I was very familiar with the software. He happened to know somebody in Guatemala with an internet connection at their house. And I think their internet connection was like half a megabyte up and
Oh God.
1 megabyte down. Like it was really, it was like just so barely able to do this. And so he ended up getting us connected, and I let my company know. I spent, over the last 2 weeks with my company, another 3 weeks before I went down. So a total of 5 weeks, I started learning Spanish online. By the time I got down there, I could understand about 30-40% of what was coming at me. I could conjugate verbs. I could give directions. I could understand directions. I could ask for things. I could say, I don't understand. Can you, how do you say this? So very basic phrases that were very survival necessary were within my toolkit now. And I just thought to myself, wow, if I would have had this in high school and had learned this for like 2 years in this sort of format, how much more fluent could I have been? So I just started thinking like, wow, like somebody's got to do this. Started looking up online, no real companies that were actually doing it. And so I was like, okay, here you go. And so I would say, on the tail end of my, like as I was starting to phase out of my contract and my contract was ended up starting the company in moonlighting, and then went full time in 2010. So, or at the end of 2010. And that was the start of the business. And so started in a little tiny apartment, was able to fix some of the big problems such as redundancy. The internet was very bad and has only recently gotten slightly better. And so just having understanding about how, redundant networks work and things of that nature really helped me have a competitive advantage because, the idea wasn't novel, right? And other Spanish schools were trying to do what I was doing, but they didn't have the technical knowledge in terms of how networks work, but then also didn't have the US connection, which I did.
Right.
And so anyway, I started off in a tiny apartment, my first office, quote unquote, was underneath my bed. I paid a carpenter $100 to loft my bed, and I was sitting underneath my bed with a lamp that was literally up here shining down. And I did that for 2 years. And anyway, now we're at 200 teachers and several thousand, almost 10,000 students, around 8,000 students around the world and over 50 countries, like you mentioned in the bio. So that's kind of a quick up to speed version of how I got to where we are today.
I love that story. I just think it shows so much resourcefulness to see the opportunity and then do the things that need to happen, put the things in place and in motion that need to happen in order to get you there.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. So when we talked a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that we talked about was the reason why I love what you do is kind of how you, as an American who didn't speak Spanish for very long, you hadn't spoken Spanish for very long before you actually decided to embark on this venture. And you learned some really interesting things about working in Guatemala in particular, but things that you've been able to extrapolate as you've expanded and have been working in other countries. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think kind of the underlying or one of the foundational things that I learned was that you can't just straight copy and paste what you know in the United States to be true and then expect it to work in a different country. I think that was one of the biggest things that I took away. And even being someone that I consider very I traveled a lot in the military. I came from a very diverse background. I am of ethnic origin myself in my family background. But even all of those different data points didn't really, prepare me for the experiences that I would have in Guatemala. And so upon traveling, like one of the big things that you learn just as a tourist, for example, even as you're traveling through, is that you have, 3 different prices. And you have to be aware of this so that you don't get ripped off. And so you have the tourist price, or effectively in Guatemala, they call it the gringo price. You have the local price. So you could be a gringo, but live there locally, right? And, you also have the Guatemalan price, so the native price. And so if you know that there is, and you're aware that there is this hierarchy and structure, then you can often play that to your advantage and get the best deal possible. Learning how to negotiate as well, or just understanding that you have to negotiate is a really big thing of just living there in general.
Mhm.
And the locals actually have this understanding that, oh, they're less practiced than I am. And so I know, like, if my base margin is this, right, like I can mark it up this, and I know that they'll only like negotiate it a little bit down.
Mhm.
So anyway, that was one of the foundational things that I learned. We were sharing a story, or I was sharing a story with you in terms of how I often negotiate. So I know that me as Ron Fortin going to negotiate a deal often yields the worst results. So now I actually send agents to go on my behalf, and they're local agents. They're typically Guatemalan, and they hands down get way far better deals than I could ever get. I feel comfortable going to like the market and negotiating things like that. But this as soon as they pick up on an accent, or as soon as they pick up on, some perception switch in their head, like no matter what you say, no matter what you do, like you're just going to get not as good of a deal as if you sent somebody else. So it's just the default now to send other people to negotiate on my behalf or the company's behalf. I'll give you, one quick story that I didn't share with you at the, at the beginning of the company stage. So where I had my first office, we had our landlord, and basically he was trying to, we were leaving and moving offices and moving to a new building. He wanted us to pay all the repair cost, all of, because I'd been drilling holes and all this stuff. And so like, to his credit, like he wanted me to pay like on top of the repairs, and then like just in a ridiculous amount of money on top. So I had recently hired my operational director, and she's married to a Guatemalan. So she's a foreigner herself, so she couldn't go. But her husband is Guatemalan and is a wonderful negotiator. And so he went on our behalf. And so not only did he negotiate to say, no, you're not going to have to pay that, but they also gave us the deposit back, which was not normal at all. And so just understanding that, and that was kind of like the first instance of like understanding like, oh, wow, like I have been, people have been taking advantage of me because of this. And I know that in the future moving forward, that this is the best path. So
I think that's an important thing to kind of unpack to a certain extent. It's, whether, even if you are in your own country, so even if you're in the US, I mean, and this has happened with me a handful of times, when it just turns out that I'm not the most effective person to be negotiating that particular situation.
Right.
And having the self-awareness to say, I think that there's a better deal to be had here, but I've reached the extent of what I can do. I need to bring in somebody else to help take it over the finish line, and to kind of remove the ego from that process, because you don't always have to be the one doing the deal. The other thing is that when you're a smaller business, there's it's often useful to have an escalation path in the negotiation process, where, especially if you're the owner or the founder, and because as owners and founders, our businesses are kind of like our children, and we get very emotionally attached to the outcome. And so what happens by having a third party engage on your behalf is that the final decision maker, being you, isn't in the room. So if there becomes a sticking point or an issue, then that third party has to come consult to you. So that gives that person the ability to do things like, well, I really understand where you're coming from, and I totally see your perspective, but I am just not authorized to agree to that. I got to go back. I got to go check with the owner, right? or check with the boss or the CEO or the board. I often tell smaller organizations, make sure you have an advisory board at minimum. Not that your advisory board has veto rights, but if you in your relationship or the kind of the deal that you have with your advisory board, say that major customer decisions, major supplier decisions you're going to talk to them because they're your advisors. You're going to go back and you're going to say, all right, this customer wants to do A, B, C, and D, or the supplier wants A, B, and C. What should I do? Give yourself that out. Give yourself that escalation path so that when you're sitting at the table, you can actually say to your counterpart, this is something that I'm committed to taking to my advisory board to discuss, right? It gives you so much more power and leverage, but you've got to be self-aware to get your ego to put your ego to the side, to create that escalation path for yourself, because you can find power through that process that you may not have if you didn't have that. And I love that you're talking about when we're in different cultures, the importance of understanding that there can be different prices for different, and certainly, I mean, in many countries, you see an American coming and it's like the price skyrockets.
That's right.
Right. And it's not our culture. Like if you're talking about going to a market where you're haggling, right? It's not in our culture to haggle.
Right.
And so we don't have experience doing that.
That's
and, to your point, they know that. So they know that they'll jack up the price, and they know that they'll come down a little bit, but there's still a lot more room in there.
Right.
And it's just not in our experience to do that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, it's really, it's absolutely the truth. And I think one of the other things that I thought was really interesting, just living in another culture, was just the difference in just emotional negotiation and ego, right? Like you had mentioned that part. Like I personally don't get really heated I'm very like neutral. I don't get very hot. I don't get very cold. It's just very like, here it is. And a lot of, the interactions business wise or what have you, during my time, it has been the case. Like they've not necessarily emotional, but just ego driven. Like we were negotiating an internet contract, for example, right? And fiber optics in the US is very common, but in Guatemala, it's very rare, right?
Right.
And not only do you have to get all these different permissions, but there's only like a couple of companies that can actually do this thing. And so, I mean, in the US, and again, you're taking it for granted that in the US, you can get something like 100 megabytes for like $20 a month or something like that, right? Like down there, you're paying like $1,000 for like 20 megabytes of data. Right. So like, anyway, these contract negotiations, and again, they're paying like hundreds of dollars per megabyte. You have some salespeople who are very tied, and they just want to push on you. And again, that's where time and how you kind of mentioned that. Like, I don't think I've ever negotiated a significant contract in a day. Like, it's always taken multiple meetings. They've had to come from the Guatemala City, and that has also been a shift where in the US, everything can get done. It's like speed and efficiency. And the ego actually lengthens time in contracts and how long they take in order to complete. So I just, that's another cultural aspect that I just think is so fascinating. And so when we're doing our projections, like whether it's a building or an internet contract or any type of negotiation, we don't just add 20%. We generally add like 50% in terms of length in order to make sure that it gets completed and it doesn't mess up anything on the back end that we have following that.
Now I'm curious. So a lot of times I've negotiated with different, major corporations throughout the globe and whatnot. And, in my experience, not having a contract, so like, let's say it's a customer contract. Well, it could even be a supplier contract. Our ability to get product and service is not impeded by our or having a contract or not. I mean, as long as we're in the process of negotiating, then most companies in the United States don't have an issue giving product, selling product under, that then becomes governed by the contract,
Right.
or buying product that then becomes governed by the contract.
Interesting.
And sometimes you have kind of high level things that kind of come into play. In Guatemala, kind of what's that process like? Do you wait until you have a contract? Is it a hard contract? Is it a handshake contract? How does contracting work? Because in the the United States has the most complex contracting processes on the planet. It's crazy. Other countries do not use contracts the way that the United States does.
Wow.
Europe does, the UK does more, and Europe does more. But once you leave kind of that, you go to Asia, they have a completely different contracting structure. It's just, you can have a multi-billion-dollar relationship that's on a very small number of pages. And so versus here, it's like a 200-page contract. So tell us a little bit how contracting works in Guatemala, and how your knowledge of Spanish early in the company's history impeded your ability to negotiate those effective, because it's a different language. You can be fluent in a foreign language and not be fluent in the business side of things.
So good question. So in terms of contracts are extremely or operate differently and are utilized differently, and they are hard contracts. I don't think I've ever had anyone provide service per se, like an official business. They won't provide service without that actual contract. I'm talking about rent. I'm talking about internet. Those are our biggest, expenses. Everything else is either on a per purchase basis or something of that nature, where product is delivered and not ongoing. So everything's either transactional, right? Like one-time use transactional, and not extended contracts. But no, there's such a big trust issue, right? Like there's a huge trust issue within that culture. So, and even in my own culture, being Filipino, right? Like when I go to the Philippines, I hear there's a lot of that same sort of perspective, where within your own clan, within your tribe, within your own network, and the people that you can extend X, Y, or Z, right? There's some leeway there. But if it's somebody that you don't know, the amount of trust between those two parties is like zero zilch. And not only that, but the entire process is physically longer, meaning they still operate on physical signatures. Like not only do you have to do physical signatures, sometimes you actually have to get stamps, like actually lick them and and paste them on the paper. And then you have to get a signature by this person. And then you got to go get a stamp by the ministerio, the local government. And
like
that's why
notary?
I say,
like notarizations and stuff in the US?
Like a notary, but from a specific office.
Oh, got
so it. Not just any notary, people can be, have that as their job. No, you got to go to this specific office with this particular seal, and you gotta, they're only open during certain hours. You go there, but then they send you to this place over there, but that's not the right thing because your paperwork wasn't right. So then you got to start back from square one. So just figuring out that system took several years in itself.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that would be trial and error. And yeah.
And so again, if you go to, and I was lucky in that I had, mentors, advisors in country that were gracious enough to kind of point me in the right direction. And I was persistent enough to keep asking. So, because that's a big part of it too. A lot of people just give up because they're like, well, this is too ridiculous. With that being said, in terms of understanding contracts, there was a lot of Googling and just setting aside enough time to go through all of the stuff. And then on top of that, after you read it through 2 or 3 times, then you still, I still ask, more subject matter experts, hey, I understood it to be this and to say this. Does it actually say this? And then oftentimes, even today, it's like, well, no, this paragraph here, you interpreted it one way, but it actually means this. And so there's still like, I still, when I review contracts, it still takes me extra long. I still have to write in margins and ask about certain things. And so it's still difficult, but albeit it's gotten, much, much easier over the years. So
I think so one of the things that I found, I was talking to somebody, he's a CPA, and he had an account, and he was telling me this story of the company was a strawberry grower, and they were in Mexico. And the company that he was working with, that his client was here in the US, and they bought the strawberries from Mexico, and then they did, made product with those strawberries. And they got a batch of bad strawberries and needed to expedite a new order from the farm in Mexico. So they get on the phone, and he's telling me, and by the way, the CPA is from Mexico, and he's telling me, he's like, when you're doing stuff, especially in Central and South America, but because that's his area of influence, and mine, I mean, I'm like, it's true throughout the world. Whenever you're working in not your native language, you have to be very clear on what a definition is, right? It can be the smallest definition. So they said, we'll expedite it, but there was no clear definition of what expediting meant. So to the American company waiting on the strawberries, expedited means it'll be over the border in 24 to 48 hours, 3 days at most, right? To the Mexican, 2 weeks later, they didn't have the expedited strawberry.
Nope.
So it's really, but this is true even when you're working in the US. If you've got language where there could be an interpretation and two different definitions, make sure you have clarity on what that definition is, so that it eliminates the challenge of when you ask for something and you think it's one thing, but your counterpart interprets it as something else, and you don't have a way of reconciling those two different definitions. And something that simple is easy to solve, so that it doesn't impact your relationship negatively.
Or your business in that regard. Like 2 weeks can be an eternity for.
Yeah, especially for strawberries, right? It's like, okay.
Yeah, for sure.
So I love that story, though. It's like, I can just imagine just sitting and waiting and getting on the phone over and over and over again. And it's like, but we're hurrying. And it's like, but that isn't what I thought.
Yeah. And I think that's, where another example of where on the American side, it could be like a frustration of, man, if I had another person, I don't want to bother them, or, like, I don't want to take up somebody else's time, or that's not efficient, right? Like, we're so, pressed on efficiency. That's an example of where, like, it's a big time vendor or something of that nature, where, again, I rely on my agents and my people to double check that I understood exactly what they were saying, because the other people around me, like, if I miss something, I'm depending on them to actually catch that, that nuance. So I go in there with many of my negotiations now. It's not just me. It's not just my director of operations. It will be my accountant, for example. It'll be my lawyer, for example. And I've also found that sometimes my accountant's agency will send somebody who has a little bit more legal accounting expertise, understands the rules and things like that nature. And so I just feel a lot more protected on that front. And it just helps negotiations go so much smoother. The questions get answered. I understand inevitably what's going on, and now I can have additional side conversations about it. I'll take notes, and then we'll recap and after the party leaves or hangs up. But then we'll rebrief, and then we always just make sure that we're all on the same page, and that helps. So
yeah, and I think that I like one of the things you just kind of talked about that I haven't really actually talked too much about on the show at all, is concept of negotiating as a team. And team negotiations can be very, very beneficial. One, because everybody's paying attention to different things. Everyone hears things from their own perspective.
Right.
So, a person is talking and 5 different people hear 5 different things because they're hearing it from their own perspective, which is rooted in their own history. And so you get a richness in terms of understanding when you have a team, as long as the team is all on the same page before you're engaging with a counterpart. Yes. Everybody has a clear role. Everyone knows what they're there to do, and people are not tripping over each other as they're in that process. But for smaller companies, I always tell people, if you can, in a negotiation, have at least 2 people in the conversation. One person to do the talking and one person to write notes, because there's a difference between what we write and what we hear. And so when you walk out of a meeting, you'll often have, the person who is doing the talking and the listening will pick up on something, but the person who is writing notes will have picked up on something different. And so it's a really good way to kind of determine, to get a more holistic picture of what was actually being said.
100%.
So one of the questions is, as Americans, we have a very interesting relationship with conflict, right? Other cultures have different relationships with conflict. Tell us a little bit about how, as an American working in Guatemala, how conflict has kind of, how you've had to deal with that, and what are some of the strategies you've used to address that, and how that's different from how you might do it in the US.
Yeah, so in the US, or in Guatemala, I should say, conflicts take on a different perception or require a different strategy. Specifically in that there is this concept known as a power distance struggle. In a book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, he ends up talking about this airline, Korean Air, and it ends up, I don't want to spoil the book, but anyway.
Great book. Highly recommend that
great book.
One of my favorite books.
Yeah, I don't mean to spoil this chapter, but it's just a chapter. So anyway, Korean Air, they end up having a bunch of consecutive plane crashes. And so they do an investigation as to why that happened. And the common thread between that was this concept that came out of that was power distance struggle, meaning to say the co-pilots weren't able to talk directly to the head pilot, the main pilot. And they were always dancing around the situation, meaning to say, oh, you should probably take a look at that meter, as opposed to, hey, you're going to crash us, pull up on that stick or whatever, right? And so Korean Air was number 2 in the book in terms of being very passive. The United States was number 1 in terms of being very aggressive, meaning to say, in the United States, if something's wrong, people are not afraid to tell you that you're wrong to your face and be very blunt about it. On the other side of the spectrum, I say Korean Air was number 2, or Korea was number 2. Number 1 was actually Guatemala in the book. And so you see that all across the board. It always depends on who feels like they are in the position of power. And so you got to really understand that and kind of take that into calculation when you're going through these negotiations. And it can play in various ways. So the reason why you send, like when you go up to a negotiation and you are a gringo, for example, a foreigner, and you're trying to negotiate something, well, there's some defensive mechanism to that individual that says, oh, I don't want to show that I'm weak. So therefore they will try to one up you or best you. And that's a form, to me, a part of a form of aggression, right? Like, I don't want to get the fair deal. I want to get a better deal than you. So therefore I will jump up the price. With employees, there's a huge, power distance struggle as well. And so that's something that you need to consider when just talking to your employees or your fellow colleagues. Essentially what ends up happening is you need to figure out in those conversations when you're negotiating, let's say, a work contract, You want to be able to relate to them, build rapport in order to let them open up a little bit before you can have the actual conversation that you were meaning to have.
Right.
So,
Wow. And that book is phenomenal. So if to the audience, if you haven't read Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, highly recommend it. Also highly recommend Talking to Strangers. That one I like even better.
I haven't read that one yet. But...
Yeah, it's really good. Highly recommended. It has some really great stories in it about how when we meet people, we misjudge, we misinterpret and who the person is. And it's a powerful lesson in how our own judgment can cloud our, what's real. So highly recommend that. So what are some of the other kind of things, like if an American was thinking about doing business in Guatemala, or really in any foreign country, what are the top 3 lessons that you've learned that they need to be thinking about as they move forward into kind of theoretically uncharted territories from a business perspective?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is to be humbled, right? And just understand that you're not going to learn everything overnight. You're not going to bring over a system that will work on day one. You can implement bits and pieces and you can modify things, but you want to be humble about those sort of things. I would say the other thing is to really get to know the Guatemalan culture, or whatever country you're going to, understand that culture and their people, and that includes their history as well. There's a lot of, we go to power distance struggle stuff. There's a lot of history with the United States, everything from, the Banana Wars to just even like Spanish colonialization, right? Like we're talking about power distance struggle and structure. A lot of that comes from colonial periods and the conquistadors and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
And so understanding that and trying to view that lens is really key. And then also understanding just patience, and that everything is going to take 3-4 times as long as you think it is. And so I would say those are the biggest 3 things that, on top of language, of course, and that I would recommend to anyone who's thinking about starting a business. The other thing I would also mention is that there's a ton of opportunity there, just because it's I feel like I'm giving away a secret here, but it's really close to the United States. It's really close to the United States. The Spanish is almost identical to Mexico with, a few caveats here or there. And so like anything that's being used in the United States is also in Guatemala in terms of Spanish language. They talk really slow. The overall environment, especially in tourist areas like Antigua, is really relaxed, much slower pace of living. Hence, it takes 3-4 times to get things done, 3-4 times longer to get things done. But it's really a beautiful place to work once you start to figure out things. And the people are amazing. The food's amazing. The just the overall lifestyle is pretty great too. And so I would highly encourage it. There will be some challenges if you were to start a business anywhere, there are going to be challenges, but just be aware that there are some additional challenges because it's not what you're used to.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I love what you just said, because especially when you were talking about history and understanding the country. We had a guest on a while ago named Mimi Dara, and she has a company called Maison Palo Santo, and she's out of Ecuador, and she used to also have a company that operated in Morocco. And so she talks about the importance of local, kind of being international, but operating very locally, and how understanding local culture, not just country culture, but local culture, because, geography drives a lot of, politics, and a lot of, and borders are, established because of politics. And that's true at a regional level. So understanding kind of the local culture, the local politics, the local history is really important. I mean, in all of Central America and South America, you've got indigenous populations, you've got the people who came over and colonized the region, and they have very interesting, every country in Central and South America have interesting relationships with the United States, because we've had our history is influencing a lot of that geopolitical environment, which leads to very different views of what it is, what Americans are and aren't.
Yeah.
And then the culture kind of war between the indigenous populations and the colonials is a huge issue. And Lyra, who's my daughter, to the audience, my daughter Lyra introduced me to Ron, as I said earlier, and she lives in Guatemala, and so she talks a lot about that and the challenges that come with that, from just that colonization perspective versus the indigenous peoples. So
you kind of triggered something in terms of a point that I wanted to at least mention in terms of things that I've learned, other things that I've learned during my time in regarding negotiation. So especially lately, we've been trying to hire a lot of folks in order to fill our demand and our need and all this and all of our different departments. What I've learned in terms of negotiating on the employee front is searching for their why and appealing to that why, right? Their intent, right? I don't know what the technical jargon would be, but essentially what I ask in my interviews is like, my big goal is to understand their why. And so understanding their why generally, at least the people that speak to me the most, is I'm not necessarily interested in the people who, command high salary figures, or especially if they've had, years and years of experience. The people that I'm really searching for and I'm able to negotiate the best for in terms of wages are people who are looking for something more than salary. So they're generally looking for things like hope and like mission type oriented. Like they want to be part of something bigger. They want to be part of a company that's stable, and they want stability. And this idea of safety within a company has been one of the things that I found gives us a stronger bargaining position or negotiation platform. Is just like we can offer all those things, like, and things that, again, difference between the US and in Guatemala, stable income, right? Like 12 months out of the year, we pay on time. I know that sounds ridiculous, but paying on time is a big deal. Health benefits, right? Like, like people don't do that. And then in Guatemala, they have this salary payment deal to where it's a law where you have to pay 14 payments versus 12. So you get 2 extra payments throughout the year. One's at the middle of the year, one's at the end of the year. And those are by law, part of the contract. And a lot of people, more often than not, are independent workers. Like we would consider them 1099 in the United States, but in Guatemala, they're known as like individual contractors. With that designation, you can get paid more, but you don't get the extra benefits. But people are looking for those benefits because if you pay into them, you qualify for Social Security or the equivalent of Social Security in Guatemala after you retire. And that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so when I'm able to say, yes, we offer planilla is what it's called. We offer planilla, stable this. It's a safe environment. During COVID, you can work from home, right? We're completely remote. We'll give you training. We'll give you all this speaks to, their why and their intention and things that emotionally are worth more to them than the actual sticker price tag of, wages, let's say. And so I've learned that, like what are the intangibles that people want that isn't necessarily going to be outlined in the text. So
yeah, I love that, because the thing is that whether it's a business B2B negotiation or whether it's with an employee or whether you are the employee, having an understanding of what those intangibles are is really important. I mean, I talk about it in terms of the first and most critical step of any negotiation is to get clarity, to get clear on what it is that you want, how important it is to you, and then determine, is that doable for your counterpart? Right. So when you think about when you're hiring, right, you want stability. I mean, I'm assuming that stability in your workforce is important to you. So you want people who are looking for some stability, because you want people who are going to be, you want continuity in your instructor pool. You know, understanding all of these things have an economic, you can quantify them. They all can be they're all quantifiable, but it's rare that price, I often say that price is an outcome of a negotiation, not an input. Like really effective negotiation, price is an output. And the reason for that, and salary is the same as price, it's an output, is because it's all the other things that you can apply a value to, but it's all the other things, the assumptions that go into creating the price are the things that are negotiated. Those are the things that we should focus on negotiating. So that when the price comes up, then all the assumptions are agreed and the price is just like, oh, well, that's the price because we agreed to these assumptions, right? And we assign value to those different assumptions. And so I really like that you mentioned that, because I think that's important for people who are, certainly not everyone in our audience is looking to build business in Guatemala, but if you're looking to build a business outside or expand your business outside the United States or outside your geography, or even if you're somebody who's looking for a job and you're trying to think about, how do I think about, salary? Don't just focus on salary. Think about all the other things that can come into play that have value to you. And I think that that's a really important distinction. So Ron, it's been great having you on the show. I love what you're doing. I just think I think you're just doing some amazing stuff. How do people find you? How do they find the Academy? How do they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is simply Spanish.academy. So that's Spanish.academy. So again, no .com, just .academy. It's our domain.
Perfect.
And we actually have set up a deal over at our landing page, try.spanish.academy/then. And so that, again, that's try.spanish.academy/then.
And we'll put that in the show notes. So
yep.
And thank you for that gift for our listeners. I appreciate that. That's amazing. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And so that's where you can check us out. And then all of our links to our social media will be on both of those pages. So
fantastic. So Ron, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you here. I hope that this has been a great experience for you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And for those who are listening, thank you so much for gracing us with your time. It is the most valuable gift that you can give to us. I hope to see you at vennegotiation.com, where you can check out our programs, subscribe to In the Ven Zone. Please go rate and review it. Love to get your feedback, your thoughts and ideas. If you have great ideas for guests or topic ideas, just go to ven.zone and you can find information where you can plug it in and let us know. Also, my new book, Why Not Ask? A Conversation About Getting More, is available for pre-order on our website. So please go check that out. We look forward to seeing you next time on our next episode of In the Ven Zone. And just remember that negotiation is nothing more than a conversation about a relationship, no matter what country you're in, and you cannot win a relationship. Happy negotiating. We'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay. We invite you to visit our website at www.ven.zone to access the show notes and other helpful resources. Empower the negotiator in you and successfully level the playing field. Join us again next time here on In the Ven Zone.